Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by the National Science Teachers Association. You can find out more at nsta.org. While you're there, take a look at NSTA's National Conference this spring from April 11th to the 14th in St. Louis. We hope to see you there. You're listening to the Lab Out Loud podcast, Science for the Classroom and beyond. And today we're taking a look at what happened to the insects in our textbooks.
Anything and everything about our lives involves insects in some way or another. There was a lot more attention to insects as vectors for disease, as pollinators for crops, as pests of crops, and that was portrayed in the past, and it's missing now.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel. It's interesting because I don't want to give away the show, so I'm going to try to do this without.
This is a show that's more than just insects too. This is one of those, like, think about the really textbook and think about
instruction.
You're right. No spoilers here.
Course design. So I'm going to, even though there's a spoiler in like the title and in if you read the little intro, it kind of tells you how the show's going to come out. So don't worry.
Don't read.
don't read. Just listen. This is a podcast, not a book. But it is important to note. Look, I'm gonna try to say this without giving it away. But in order to do the show notes, I have to do a featured image. That's the long banner that goes across the top of the episode.
Oh, so on our webpage, you always put a nice picture.
Yeah. And this was one of those where, okay, we're talking about textbooks. I'm like, okay, well, I can do this. I can take my own picture. And I do when I get a chance. So I went to the high school where I taught for 15 plus years. And I was like, hey, I need some older textbooks, and had a conversation with some of the teachers that I used to work with there about, basically what we're talking about in the podcast, which the research was done for the college level. I experienced just visually with the high school textbooks. It was one of those like, oh my gosh, this is happening.
Did they have a bunch of old textbooks? Like, did you have like sort of an archive?
Yeah. So there was the new ones that have definitely had their NGSS stamp on them. Yep. And then
probably more than stickers.
But they definitely have their NGSS influence. I'll just say it that way. Yeah. And there's also some of the textbooks that I used when I was teaching there, and some older ones too. And it was really fascinating to look. And even I think about when I was in high school, and like we basically did like half of biology was looking at one phylum per week, and we did a dissection that corresponded with that. Okay, that's just, it's changed. That's what I'm going to say. So I experienced this, but I want to hear what all you have to say. So after listening to the podcast, because that's really important here.
So there's homework for this podcast.
There's homework here for you. If you have experienced what the podcast is talking about, give us a note, send us a message, leave a comment, because I do think that this is grounds for future episodes to talk a little bit about how this has changed. And it was shocking to me, and I think some of you are going to feel the same way. But before you contact us, of course, listen to this show. We're talking with Jennifer Landin.
My name's Jennifer Landin, and I'm an associate professor at North Carolina State University, Department of Biological Sciences.
And Dale actually found this article and asked me, like, you got to go get this person on the show. And so that's where Jennifer is right here. But the article is titled "The Decline of Insect Representation in Biology Textbooks Over Time." I tell you, though, I printed this out and I was carrying it around with me today. And I work with elementary teachers, and the kindergarten teacher basically said to me, "That is not what I expected to see in your hands today." And I had to go through, like, I'm a former science teacher. I was a high school science teacher for 15 years, and she's like, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. But it did catch our eye. Can you tell us a little bit, like a little summary of this?
Yeah, sure. So what my student and I did was to, by the way, I do need to call out my student, Kiran Gangwani. She's fabulous. She did most of the work on this paper, and it's wonderful. She and I looked at 88 college textbooks, introductory biology, and looked over time to see how the representation of insects has changed over basically 100 years. And we saw a huge decline, not only in the number of pages, but also in the number of images shown of insects. And in a fun little quirk, we ended up looking at a change in the language of how insects are described.
So what was that?
The change in the language?
Yeah.
Yeah, so older textbooks, early 1900s, used a lot of emotional language. I think they did it in general, but of course we were only looking at descriptions of insects. So, for instance, and this is both positive and negative, they would use terms like describing insects as pests or destructive or filthy. Or on the positive side, they would describe them as industrious, friends, helpful.
Industrious.
Yes. The ants, of course.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I guess I don't remember seeing like some of that in the textbooks that we used in high school even. That so what was the range of, what were some of the oldest textbooks that you had here?
We actually had textbooks dating back to 1907, I believe. And
wow.
the big change we saw seemed to occur around 1960. And so we figured that since a lot of the textbooks were describing human relationships with insects extensively, before that time, a lot of that had to do with disease, of course, disease transmission, and some of it had to do with pests of crops. So, of course, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s was the age of pesticides.
DDT and stuff.
Exactly. So it was really neat to see how textbooks reflected shifts in our society, technology, everything.
Backing up, how on earth did you discover this? I mean, what drew you to this?
It's interesting. I had a course when I was getting my PhD in the history of science, and I was looking at textbooks and got really interested in older textbooks. I had been interested in animal diversity and how that is portrayed in textbooks. I knew it was decreasing or had decreased, but I did another project with a graduate student, Lynette Phillips, and we saw just in animal diversity chapters a huge decline over time, and all of that was attributed to the loss of insects. So Kiran and I went and delved further into that topic.
So it's definitely something you stumbled upon.
Oh, definitely. That's research, right? You go down.
I would love to be at that moment where you're kind of like, wait a minute, are we seeing this? Was there a time where you're like, is this something? And then you made the decision to go farther? The animal diversity decline was not a surprise. Seeing it all in one small group, well, the largest group of animals, but still one distinct group of animals was a bit of a surprise. I figured it would be a little bit more dispersed. When you say animal diversity decline, so that means that just the textbooks were just not talking about all the animals that exist? Or all of our options?
They do.
I'm a physics teacher, so I'm confusing.
Well, good for you. I don't know anything about physics.
Now I want to go and see if there's a decline in... Well, it appears that magnetism's been trailing off.
Well, of course, animal diversity is presented in modern textbooks, but it's does not reflect the diversity that's actually present. So in textbooks, for example, 44% of the images, we were looking at images, are of vertebrates, whereas only about 4% of animals in nature are vertebrates. So a little bit overrepresented there.
Well, but pandas are cute.
Yeah, that's
adorable.
exactly what, wasn't there a comedian that said, like, what about, they were just catering to the cute animals?
Well, but you call that taxonomic bias.
Yes. Yeah.
And did you see are there other groups that are affected by this as well? Is it like the insects being pushed in the corner or someone joining you? Where are the echinoderms in all this?
Well, taxonomic bias is anything that's underrepresented. Obviously, nematodes are incredibly ugly and boring.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, don't say that. No, they are not.
No. I'm not agreeing with you. Because one of my favorite people is a nematode specialist, and so
What?
Yeah.
Okay, back up. What's a nematode, first of all?
A nematode is a roundworm.
Okay.
And they're about 20% estimated at this point of animal species on the planet.
I like how Brian just drops in. What am I?
Well, no. So the C. elegans is one of the, like, I guess the model organism for the nematode, and one of my professors from college was like one of the most well-known nematode specialists around.
Who knew?
Yeah. Very important for developmental biology, neurobiology, genetics.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was with you on that. I wasn't agreeing they should be underrepresented there.
Right. Well, I think one of the most well-studied versions of types of taxonomic bias is called plant blindness. So we tend to not even see plants.
Really?
They're a huge percentage of life on Earth, and yet we tend to just glance right over them.
Aren't bacteria just kind of going, ahem?
Yeah, right. My microbiologist friends are going to be upset about this. Of course, bacteria are the biggest biomass and most important group. But in terms of taxonomic bias, it's generally portrayed as in terms of plants, in terms of insects, anything that has a large biomass, a large influence on the ecosystem, and yet is under-researched, under-portrayed, just not paid attention to.
I would actually argue, I think that bacteria have probably had their, I guess what you'd call they've had their day in the sun, because we've studied them more in terms of infectious diseases, as well as their role in DNA editing with restriction enzymes and whatnot. So they're probably like, yeah, this is our time.
So what are we seeing with insects over the long haul then? We see that the names and how we talk about them, the language we use is different. Then there's fewer photos. Anything else?
Just the number of pages has declined about 75%.
Wow.
75%. That's a huge difference there.
Does that mean that they knew more about bugs? Well, not knew more, but they just spent more time on insects?
They seem to address more human-insect interactions. So there was a lot more attention to insects as vectors for disease, as pollinators for crops, as pests of crops. Anything and everything about our lives involves insects in some way or another, and that was portrayed in the past, and it's missing now.
Did you go into sort of reasons why this change may have occurred?
Yes. We, in our discussion at the end, it's our belief that it seems that 1960 is the turning point. And so it appears that the loss of interactions with insects, thanks to pesticides, whether that be good in terms of pests on our crops or disease transmission, or bad in the case of a loss of pollinators. And I'm sure you've seen the recent articles about the insect apocalypse, this huge drop in the number of insects, even in natural areas. We seem to be...
well, I've heard about the bees, but I didn't realize it was affecting more insects than that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, even in natural areas where we're not even spraying. So there's a huge drop in insects globally, and we haven't seen that since about 250 million years ago.
Interesting.
It's a little bit concerning, but it's also dropping out of our textbooks too, so we're not even paying attention to it.
So it's like a canary in a coal mine, if I can, borrow from another phylum.
Jeez.
The science joke's going to abound in this episode, folks. But
I was trying to work in like every kind of bug here. Like that was a good joke, Brian, but all I hear is crickets.
Oh! Okay, so I guess I didn't really recognize this happening under our noses. And what's the consequence? What should we be concerned about?
Well, I think this article I really see it as part of a bigger picture, that more and more research is coming out showing how we are losing natural history content in education. And that has consequences for the next generation at a point in time when the environment is becoming more and more important. We can't continue to ignore it. We really need to start learning and understanding everything we can about the life forms we share.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help thinking about science standards, especially with an emphasis on principles of different engineering principles. And then you can kind of think about this and say, well, we can't build things with this. We're not interacting with it, so we're skipping over it.
It's certainly not the latest newfangled information, but there's a ton of information that is being learned that could be, of course, all these animals have unique problem-solving approaches to how they deal with struggles in their environment, and it's all something that we can learn from. There are, new surgical adhesions that are based on these really horrifying-looking worms, which are not insects, but we're talking about animal diversity. And insects have tremendous defense mechanisms, fascinating feeding approaches, really interesting interactions with bacteria and other insects. There are so many things to learn from them, and as the pesticides cease to work, really understanding how insects that we interact with regularly, how they function, how they use resources, that's going to become more and more important.
Mm-hmm. I picked up on a piece that you have in the paper. It's on the first page, basically. The lack of exposure to accurate and fully representative information can contribute to the embedding of alternate conceptions that do not correspond with scientifically accepted knowledge. And that really stuck with me because we see that a lot, and especially in educational circles, we're trying to look at the hidden bias, and we're trying to confront some of that because we know that that affects how students learn. And this is a shocking revelation because this is a very clear. We have the data on this, so how do we react to that, and how do we change that?
Are you asking me? That is a big question.
I'm just, I was just...
Yeah, solve all the problems. Come on.
Jennifer, what would you do? What's your... we want the bullet points, number 1, number 2, and... It was an epiphany of mine. Sorry, I was just...
That's great. It is like the draw a scientist test.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you're only exposed to, of course, male scientists, then and
The lab coat.
in the lab coat with the goggles,
Crazy hair.
with the frizzy hair, it's basically Einstein, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
People draw. But I would say one of the largest pieces of advice that I can think of is, and I realize this is at the university setting, but universities have been losing their faculty who do research into natural history. There's a really great study by someone named Tewksbury, who figured out that the average biology major now needs a grand total of 0 natural history courses to graduate.
Wow.
Weird.
Yeah, and a lot of students and that I've seen come through don't realize some really basic information about animals. And I think it's something that we need to train teachers more on so that they feel comfortable being outside and playing in the dirt. You know, just like if the teachers feel comfortable with that, then they're going to get the kids outside playing in the dirt, and that's where you see all the good bugs.
Well, I think that's definitely important. I even think back to my biology major, and you could see a marked shift towards microbiology and molecular biology at that point, and some away from the natural history too. I mean, I still had a healthy dose of it, but I could see where that was changing. Even so much as when I got out into, my career and into the world, the idea of having a biology major wasn't necessarily that I could understand everything in the landscape around me, but my forte was more in the, at the lab bench under the microscope than it was out in the world. So that's an interesting kind of piece there. But it makes me think about how that shapes what I taught, and even in like the course designs that I had, and we're seeing more teachers designing their own content, especially as we have learning management platforms that might be going away from textbooks in some ways, or they may not rely as heavily on textbooks. And
I'm so sad.
Well, and are they drifting farther? Are those inherent biases taking over more? Because at one point, the textbook was at least a standardization approach there. So, I'm just kind of thinking out loud.
I think you raise a really great it's a great comment, and it's a whole other issue to discuss. Like I was using, Kiran and I were using textbooks as historical documents. Mm-hmm. Are we going to have that going into the future? There is a set of standards. When you have a textbook that has gone through review processes, it's like a peer review to publish a textbook. You're also exposing the society to similar pieces of information so that people can share and they come from a shared background. It's really interesting. The whole thing is fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, we see this in other areas too. The trust in institutions. I struggle with that sometimes because it seems, good Lord. We just can't have an authoritative anything anymore. Everything can be looked at from another viewpoint or discredited. Like,
we're not going to go there, are we?
we're not going there, but there is I guess we're going there, but we talk about the role of fact checking now in society and how difficult it is becoming. and because we're so savvy at presenting cases, from a viewpoint that we want. Without that, you're right. Without that, saying like this textbook is what we look towards, we'll just be all over the place, won't we?
It's the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah, yeah. Again, not another question. It's not. This is a podcast of no answers today. But I guess maybe we can make some recommendations. Let's go back to the original question at hand, the insects representation in textbooks. What can our listeners do? They're high school teachers, they're elementary school teachers, middle school teachers. Any suggestions?
Well, I think a great aspect of online resources is that there are a lot of educational activities that you could add in. I shouldn't say that. You can clearly tell that I don't teach K through 12 if I'm talking about adding in more content.
Yeah,
that's the other piece. Mm-hmm. Well, but that was going through my head too, that there's been a focus on depth versus breadth, and that kind of challenges the foundation of what a textbook is.
Well, and do you think that that today's educational approaches are focused more on breadth or on depth?
Well, it depends. What day is it today? Is it Thursday?
I'm going to say it depends on where you're looking.
I feel I teach a lot of introductory courses, so I do a lot of breadth-based approaches, but I think we're always being pushed towards more depth. And I feel like if you're going to teach diversity, there is an inherent breadth that is essential. You can certainly drill down if you have the time, but I think just being exposed to a wide variety of life forms, especially that don't have fur or feathers, is really important. Even just going out and doing something simple like collecting leaves gets kids paying attention to how these aren't just trees outside. There's a whole range of species. So the outdoors isn't just ladybugs and butterflies. There are many different species of ladybugs and butterflies. And while you're looking at those, hey, look at this interesting bug.
Yeah.
I think another thing is the fact that this discussion is sort of a lesson in itself, too, that some of our students could do. The idea that, all right, these textbooks, the science that we study, it is made by humans, and humans have bias. And here's an example of where we've landed so far, and how might these kinds of things happen? Could it happen in other areas? Those kinds of things. I think that's a lesson for students to learn too, because maybe they can be a little more mindful of it.
That's great. Yeah.
It's definitely a fascinating approach. Like I said, this was it was a very clear article in terms of what you could measure and what you've observed over time, and it really kind of makes us pause to think about the way we address any subject. In this case, of course, biology, but and also the role and the value of a textbook too. It made me think about a lot of things, and even from a design standpoint too, where simplicity might be a goal. Does that cut down on the images that, lots of things went through my head while reading this morning over my bowl of granola.
Well, we really appreciate, Jennifer, for the article and the work with your student. Say her name again.
Kiran Gangwani.
So we can get her credit where credit is due also. But when I saw the article, I was like, wait, what? It was just something that we had to talk to the source about. So we really appreciate you taking the time to do it and talk to us about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for your time, Jennifer.
If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com, for more information. You can also find details about all the previous episodes, and you can leave us feedback and comments. We want to hear from you.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
If you like Lab Out Loud and you love the show that we provide for you, please consider supporting the show at our Patreon page. Head on over to patreon.com/laboutloud for more information. Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartell.